Welcome back to the Untrained Outdoorsman podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jake Fleischman. This podcast is brought to you by Hasio Gear Camouflage, Hunt Arsenal Saddle Hunting Equipment, Catalyst Archery Stabilizers, and lastly, but surely not least, Hunter's Blend Coffee. We appreciate everybody's support, and if you wouldn't mind, head over to Apple and Spotify and leave a 5-star review. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe and like. Hope you enjoy today's episode.
Oh, I enjoy a good cigar.
So where are you located at now?
I'm down in South Texas.
Okay.
Yeah, we got, I don't know if you've seen the news, Mexico's blowing up. Cartels have attacked across 6 states down there. Some of us right across the border from me.
So they're shooting back.
Yeah, it's big time down there. This looks like a war.
What's the weather like down there?
Oh, it's pretty nice. It's 63 now.
Yeah, I wish it's about 20 degrees and blowing and snowy here, so.
Yeah, I see you're getting a little cold weather. Where are you located?
We're both in Wisconsin.
Yeah. I lived up in Minnesota for 11 years.
Was
Up
that-
in Bemidji.
Was that during your education,
No, that
or
was
is that afterwards?
well, I was with the Public Health Service, Indian Health Service there. I worked on the reservations there for a number of years.
But yeah, we should be good to go and get started. We appreciate you hopping on with us. Why don't you just give a little bit of background information on yourself? How you got into hunting, and then what kind of hunting you do, how that's kind of shaped your philosophy behind arrows and broadheads and lethality, and then what you're doing nowadays.
All right. Well, I can go back to as far as I can remember. I grew up in a hunting family, shooting family. Dad was an NRA rifle instructor. And I can't even remember learning to shoot. I shot my first match when I was 5 years old. And shot my first deer when I was 8. My first one with a bow when I was 12. So I've hunted a long time. And, basically once I got out of school, I shaped my whole career around being places where I could hunt. And I spent about 10 years in the Air Force, was stationed twice in Alaska, once out in Arizona, and loved Alaska, did 2 tours up there. It's where I got in most of my Alaskan hunting. I was up there for 7 years. And then I was up in northern Minnesota for 11 years. And then I did a little time in North Carolina there. My last 4 years, I ran the eye care program for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And after that, I retired and did what I'd always wanted to do, moved to Africa. Got rid of everything I had in the States, moved over there. Hunting and ballistics and all of that's always been a fascination for me. It was a common topic around the dinner table when I was growing up. It was mostly gun ballistics because my brother and my dad, neither one were interested in bow hunting. They never could understand what I saw in bow hunting. But I enjoyed the challenge of it. And it just became a passion with me. And, I hunted with traditional equipment for many years. And then in 1980, I delved over into the compound bows. And I did all the things the magazines were saying. I got light arrows going as fast as I could, which back then was about 265 feet per second. all round wheel compounds. And that year, I hit and lost 4 deer. Now, that had never happened to me. And they weren't lousy shots either. They were well placed, just failed to penetrate. And so I did what I'd always done with firearms. Something goes wrong. Well, you start looking for the background data, the research on it, try to figure out what's wrong. And there was nothing out there. Absolutely no studies, no information whatsoever. And so I started collecting my own. And in 1983, I had written about 5 years before that over to South Africa, asking about the possibility of hunting a rhinoceros with bow and arrow. And it came back, bow hunting's not legal here. You can't do it. So I forgot all about it. But they started or decided in Natal to look at the feasibility of legalizing bow hunting, mainly from the economic standpoint. If bow hunting was feasible, then, that draws extra hunters, brings extra forex into the country. And they were just having a meeting talking about, setting up their program to research it because they wanted to do background research before they legalized it. And somebody at that meeting, and I think it was probably Spud Lettingham, said, somebody wrote me asking about hunting a rhino because one of the questions they had was, well, how big an animal can you shoot with a bow and arrow? And he went and dug in his files and found my letter. And they contacted me and said, you still interested in shooting a rhino? Well, I didn't even have to think about it. So I arranged to hunt, a book paid safari to go hunt a rhino. And I went over there and we did a successful hunt on the rhino. But while I was there, they were talking to me about what they were trying to do. And, my hunt was part of their research. And they asked me would I like to come back next year, that they were going into Makuzi Park before they did the rifle call because, the park's confined space. They have to keep the game population culled down to a level that the habitat will support. And so they invited me to participate in that, but I'd have to do it on my own dime. They didn't pay me anything for it. And they asked if I could bring as many different kinds of arrow setups as I could, because one of the things they wanted to look at was what works best on the animals. And they wanted me to repeat the rhino, see if that was a fluke or if I could do it again. So I went back over and shot another rhino, and then went down to Makuzi and spent a month down there and shot 154 animals. And they wanted me to, every time an animal would come in that I thought I could hit, regardless of the position of the animal, they wanted me to take the shot because they wanted to see what happens when you have bad hits. So we were looking at all that. I was backed up with a rifle there all the time. So if we had a hit that there was any question about whether it was lethal or not, they would put the animal down with a rifle somewhere remote from where the arrow was. And we would try to autopsy the animal, see what happened, make a determination. Would it have been a lethal hit? Would it not? If we couldn't tell, we just load the animal up and carry him in. They had two veterinarians on staff, and they would dissect the animal and tell us exactly what was going on and whether it would have been lethal or not. And so I collected all that data and put it together. That was my end of their study, my part of it. And sent that back over to them to put into their final report. And they were looking at everything else. Stress on the animal, stress on the animals accompanying that animal, time from shot to animal collapse, distance traveled, almost all phases of it. And, but they were collecting all that data. I did strictly the terminal error performance. And once I got to the end of that, I had a lot more questions. So I just carried on collecting data up until I retired. And then when I moved over there, I worked some as a professional hunter. When I wasn't doing that, I was hunting on my own and got heavily involved in collecting more and more data. Wrote a number of update reports on it for publication in Magnum magazine there in South Africa, and started trying to get some of the information published, particularly the Hall study information. And it got published in a lot of places around the world long before it was published in the States. Really had trouble getting it published in the States because most of the magazines would send me back something saying, well, it's African animals, it's not applicable to North America. Some were pretty honest and said, hey, one of our advertisers' products didn't do well, and we can't carry anything about that. But I did get some encouragement from some other outdoor writers to carry on with it. It was information that was needed. And in 2001, I ended up getting kicked out of Africa because I was based in Zimbabwe, although I hunted all of Southern Africa. The U.S. Congress passed a thing called Zimbabwe Democracy Bill. And Mugabe's retaliation was that's when he was taking all the farms and stuff. He kicked all of the Americans out of the country that did not have permanent residency. And I got caught on the very first day they implemented it, and I had 24 hours to get out of Africa. So all I brought out were my rifles, which I had to bring out, and my binoculars and one change of clothes. And that was all I had left in the world. They took everything I had, house, cars, property, all of my safari kit, everything. And then I just kind of regrouped for a couple of months. And I went down, one of the clients I guided several times lived in Australia. And he said, well, come on down here. He said, we've got some good hunting down here. And so I went down and looked at it. And sure enough, it would look like a good place to carry on some of my studies. So I picked up and started living down there, spent 7 years down in Australia, New Zealand, Vanuatu, New Guinea, South Pacific area. And got involved. One of the fellows he put me in contact with, this guy named Dave Lindner, who runs a place called the Buffalo Farm. Dave was a former head ranger at Makuzi Park. Not Makuzi, excuse me, Kakadu Park. And he started back in the days when there were even no roads. You had to go in by horseback. And when he retired, he talked the Australian government into establishing this buffalo farm where they could look at the carrying capacity of the range for Asian buffalo to not degrade the habitat or interfere with the native game animals. Now, they had spent 40 years trying to eliminate the buffalo and could not do it. It's just too thick. It was just impossible, even using helicopters. They couldn't knock the herd numbers down. And so he was using the buffalo farm. He had an area that was about 7 miles by 7 miles square, fenced in, and then high fenced. And then he had internal low fencing. But he had to take about 500 buffalo a year off of there to maintain the population at the level that the habitat could support. And so I got in with Dave, and he was really fascinated with what I was trying to do. So I ended up there with almost unlimited access to animals to test on. And the bulk of the testing was done there. Well, I couldn't say more than half of it, maybe. And, I kept doing updates as the information accumulated. And, I don't know, by 2007, I had enough data that I delineated these 12 factors that are the most important in error penetration.
Before you get going on your 12 factors, I had a couple questions that came up from your little introduction background, and I'm sure Jesse may have too. But so, what was you kind of talked about what kind of made you start trying to take a different approach and try things? Some things didn't work for you and lost some animals. And I think that's kind of what happens to a lot of people is just by nature, you want to have the best possible system. And when things don't happen, you ask yourself why.
Well, one thing I started out looking at the error because, or as I call it, error. Texas accent, can't help that. With firearms, it was pretty well established and pretty well known fact that the construction of the bullet is more important than the caliber you use in determining terminal performance. So I started looking at the error as being the problem, not what launched it. Once it's in flight, it doesn't know what launched it. It's going to perform at the far end with whatever capabilities it has. And we determined in the initial Lethality study that the number one factor for an error to be non-lethal was lack of adequate penetration, hands down. It wasn't cut diameter. It wasn't anything else. It was not penetrating deep enough.
And how many years was this Natal study? Over how many years? You said 150 some odd animals.
When I did the 154 animals, that was just in 1 month there. The whole Natal study was a concentrated 2-year study by the Natal Parks Board.
So it's not like, I just want to make that clear because for people listening, it's not like you went there for a weekend and shot 5 animals and made all these conclusions.
No.
Right. It's a lot of,
and that was, that was all on live hunted animals. A lot of the test stuff I've had to do on freshly downed animals. For one thing, you can't control all the factors, shot placements and things like that you want to look at, angles of shots on a live animal, and it takes too much time. When you're trying to collect a huge amount of data, I've got somewhere over 5,000 shots in the database, not including the hunted animal database, which is totally separate, but on the freshly downed animals. If I had to spend the average 5 or 6 days per animal hunting them, I wouldn't have time to collect the data that I needed. So what we would do was go out and put a buffalo down. Most of the data was collected on buffalo. Now, it wasn't initially in the Natal study. That ran the gamut from animals sub-whitetail size all the way up to animals elk sized. So that was the size gamut of animals we had in there. But when I started looking at being able to deal with the bad hits, which are generally heavy bone hits, those are your worst scenario cases. And because animals move, no one on this earth can guarantee with an error where they're going to hit the animal. Animal reaction time is too fast. Even with the fastest bows we've got, even with crossbows, you can't control that. The reaction time is just too quick. So the animal gets a vote where that arrow is going to end up hitting the animal. So you have to look at that worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And I chose buffalo because their ribs overlap, and they are a fairly heavy bone, anywhere from about 0.62 inches all the way up to about 0.87 inches. You can guarantee a bone hit on every shot. So you can look at performance on direct 90-degree impact on bones. You can look at angular shots that hit bones where the broadhead is going to have a tendency to skid or skip. And of course, they got even heavier bones you can work on to see the capabilities there.
And so was that, I just want to kind of get your thoughts on this too before we move on, and then if Jesse has anything, but that first time that you reached out to those over in Africa wanting to hunt a rhino, was that just like a bucket list thing for you, or was this based strictly off of,
I really wanted to do.
It wasn't from the mindset of that's probably the toughest animal I could shoot and I want to figure that out so that I can translate to lesser animals?
At that
Or
point there, and still today, I think I have the only white rhinos taken with a traditional bow. There had been, I think, 3 black rhinos taken with traditional bows back then. Of course, they were even taken before the days of the compound. And they were black rhinos, which are about the half the size of a white rhino. Well, by the time I was ready to go try it, you couldn't hunt black rhino. They were on the endangered species list everywhere. And so white rhino was the only option. And so I decided, okay, I want to go try to take a rhino.
sure, it was just something that you wanted to do personally, not necessarily yet to that point of the testing.
Exactly. It was, I had taken a lot of North American big game animals at that point, and then some other animals, various places around the world. But that was the next step up.
Sure.
What was the average distance you were shooting a lot of these animals at?
Well, the test shots are standardized. They're taken at 20 yards. Now, I do have, when you talk about hunted animals, now I'm a stalking hunter. I didn't shoot very many animals out of a tree in my life. The hunted animal database I have is a cross reference to the study base to see if the results I'm getting on real animals correlates to what I'm seeing in the test shots. And I've got 631 animals in that database. The average shot distance was 15.97 yards.
Which I think that brings up a good point too, though. A lot of people argue a lot of, this data maybe from at least what I've heard. I haven't delved too much into it. I'm pretty new to the information, but a lot of people say like even some of the stuff Troy says is that that doesn't matter because it's a short distance and there's also so many more factors to realize. But if you think about it, the average shot distance for at least me, and Jesse can back this up, I mean, the average shot distance in a tree in the Midwest is probably 20 yards,
Yeah.
So it's pretty
I had
relatable information.
Conversation just recently with the guys from the hunting public. and they have tracked their shot distances for all the shots they've done the whole time they've been doing their series. Their average is a spot on exactly 16 yards. Correlates very, very well. And they're all shooting compounds.
Yeah, I think I've only taken one whitetail over 40, and I would say 95% of mine are under 20 yards.
And you can make those long, people talk about, well, you can't do that with heavy arrows. Well, the president of the foundation, the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation, Rob Nielsen, has taken, I think he's taken 11 buffalo now. And he's taken buffalo out to 40 yards, shooting, and that's shooting 1,100 grain arrows.
Yeah, there's something to be said about the trajectory, which a lot of people put too much weight in, but it's definitely a factor to consider if you're like Western hunting and your shots are 60 yards. But there's other things
Well,
that
I always that always gets my hackles up because I've done a lot of Western hunting and a lot of hunting in open plains areas around the world. I've never had to take those kind of shots. And when people say they have to take those, well, they just should learn to hunt. They're going out and shooting, not hunting.
Well,
You
and
can
even,
post
even
that the best elk hunter in North America that I know of is Jeremy Johnson. Jeremy goes in to public lands every year, usually in 2 states, pulls out monster bulls on public lands, hunting on foot, and he's never had to take a long shot like that, not a single time.
well, and even at them long distances, a heavier arrow is going to be a lot more stable.
It is stable, and you've got to maximize the use of the energy you've got in your arrow. The fastest bows around are shooting with less energy than a 22 long rifle. So the only way we can increase the effectiveness is to conserve the force of the arrow to the maximum amount possible. And that is basically what all of the 12 factors are geared around, is making maximum use of the available force of the arrow.
and it's quieter at distance too. With the heavier the arrow, it quiets your
Well,
setup down too. I've noticed that too.
That also cuts down on animal reaction.
Yep. There's a lot of other factors other than just trajectory. Like that was my point. There's all these little things you're starting to think about that you could be said improve, not just take away by making your stuff more heavy. Like I just noticed this too. I started getting back into more 3D shooting and tournaments and stuff, and I shot a couple here recently with a newly heavier arrow, and I just feel like there's so many different little things like at a known distance like that, how you're getting a rangefinder, how far it is, you know, but having a little bit heavier setup helps with wind drift, deflections on other people's arrows. It's not going to deflect as far. Um, just little things like that having a little bit heavier arrow, especially when you know the distance,
Yeah,
it
and
helps
when
you
you
with.
get to heavier arrow, one of the factors is the weight forward of center. You can move that weight to the front of your arrow, and that increases flight stability. So that's better in high winds. It helps you retain energy downfield. If you once you got your arrow tuned, you should have it tuned. It's going to give you faster recovery of paradox when you shoot, more penetration at close range because you're out of paradox. Well, we've tested it. You can get an arrow flying perfectly straight, shooting bullet holes through paper 1 yard from the bow. you could get an arrow stabilized that quickly if you set the arrow up correct. And that does, years ago when I didn't know all this stuff, I used to try to have my shots out 14, 15 yards, because they were closer than that. I didn't get as much penetration because the arrow wasn't out of paradox. And that flexing of the shaft while it's trying to go through the animal greatly retards your penetration.
Yeah, we started to mention a lot of little things that we can dive in a little deeper once you get into your 12 factors. So if you want to start, maybe we'll start, just so we're not kind of get that rolling. If you want to start with number 12, and I just want to kind of preface this with, and
You
you
want
can
to go 12 up or 1 back?
um so from however you want to do it with least, because I want to preface this and explain this a little bit, like a glass. If you take a glass of water, right? From my understanding with the 12 factors, if you start at 12 down to 1, from least important to most important, or it's not quite like that. It's, if
Yeah,
you have an,
I look at it the other way. We're actually starting out from a point and then building, adding on. I think of the 12 factors as a toolkit.
Mhm,
Every factor you add to your arrow is going to improve the penetration.
right. So if you have
I've got those factors ranked in level of importance when you look at all shots. But depending on the hit, some of them will move, particularly like the heavy bone threshold. That's factor number 12. It's really only important when you hit a heavy bone. But when you have a heavy bone, it becomes the third most important factor.
sure.
So they do move that way. So I'll go from the top down. That's
Yeah,
generally easy.
it's like a battery, right? And if it's a fully charged or not charged at all, if you're at 0%, every factor kind of adds 5% to get it up to
Yeah,
100.
and the factors, they do compound.
Hmm.
So that if you gained a certain percentage from one factor, and the next factor down adds another 10, 12%, it's adding 10, 12% of that already increased amount. So each one goes up, not quite logarithmically, but it compounds the percentage gain you're getting.
Yeah, if you want to start that way, then at the bottom
Okay.
and work up.
Well, let me get my notes up here so that I get everything right.
Sure. And then me and Jesse will just ask questions that come up after each step.
There we go. Now, the very most important factor is the structural integrity of your entire arrow system. Anything that breaks, bends on that arrow is going to destroy everything else you've tried to add to it. So the arrow must stay intact all the time. Now, what we found in the test data was that even a very, very tiny bend on the tip of the arrow will lose an average penetration of 14%. So everything about the structural integrity is important. It's just absolutely a must-have feature.
So I guess the thing that comes to mind, an example of that would be like the straightness, like getting the straightest possible arrow that you could find to start with, as far as tolerances go. Because it has any wobble, it's
No,
gonna
it's
decrease it.
got to be as perfect as you can get it. Okay, the second most important factor is achieving perfect arrow flight. A perfect arrow flight is the enabler for all the factors that follow. If you don't have perfect arrow flight, it's going to squander the force of your arrow. It's going to make all these other factors not perform optimally like they should. And even if you have every single other factor in place with good arrow flight, you'll still have poor arrow performance. So, that's the one point that people should never compromise on. They should never spare any effort, any cost, whatever it takes to achieve that perfect arrow flight. Because factor 1 and factor 2 are chiseled in stone. You've got to have structural integrity and you've got to have perfect arrow flight. Otherwise, you can forget about the other factors. You're negating the effects you would gain.
And by perfect arrow flight, you're talking downrange, not necessarily just through paper close up. Like it's flying
I'm
true,
talking about the entire flight of the arrow.
like a broadhead hitting the same spot as a field tip at distance.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Is there any things that you do or know of people doing that helps achieve that the most to guarantee something to double check to make sure, like someone who's asking themselves, is my arrow flying perfectly? What's like one or two things that you'd be able
Well,
to look at?
first off, you with a compound, you've got to have your bow set up correctly. That's a big mistake. A lot of people don't understand all that goes into getting your compound perfectly square. Now, with a traditional bow, you can't do that. It's the bow you've got is the bow you have to work with, and there you have to work, with arrow spine, point weight, everything. How far you build out the side plate, all those factors come in with a traditional bow, more so than with a compound. With a compound, it's a matter of setting the bow up so that it's absolutely true. You want that string flying perfectly straight from the time you release it until the arrow leaves. And so your compound has to be set up to achieve that perfect linear flight of the bowstring.
Sure. And that's one question me and Jesse have talked about because we set up all our own equipment. And, through talking with Troy, he's a big proponent of, getting that bow square, no cam lean, right down the middle, and then using arrow spine to get it as close as you possibly can before you start bending the bow, to where there's people out there that think that it doesn't matter as long as I get that arrow hitting at distance and have my bow tuned no matter how much I bend it to that arrow, like two inverse theories, but they both end up getting your arrow to fly at distance. If that matters in efficiency, I
Well,
guess
you
there's
want
questions
that
there, I
arrow
guess.
flying straight at distance when it impacts, uh, to help reduce arrow flex that you get when the point slows down hitting the tissue and the
Mhm.
back of the arrow is still pushing forward.
So not necessarily how you get there as long as you get there. I guess it's kind of
Yeah,
to be
that
determined.
doesn't work.
Sure. Okay. That's just a question that's come up that we didn't know kind of if there's any research behind that, if it matters or not, as long as the arrow is flying true at distance, I guess is the main thing.
Yeah, you need the arrow flying true through its entire flight because you don't know ahead of time what distance you're going to shoot at an animal. It's not like shooting a target. Okay, the third factor is extreme wake forward to center. Now, I set some definitions of that because I went way beyond, what was normally out there. Normally you had 12% or below was considered normal FOC. And between 12 and 19%, that was high FOC. Well, I think it was actually 12 and 15% that Easton had in their definitions. I set it between 12 and 19% because 19% and greater was the first point I could see an increase in penetration. that I could contribute solely to having higher FOC. And above 30, I defined as ultra extreme FOC. Because at the time I was working with it, above 30% was very, very difficult to achieve. Now, there are components now that you can get above 30%. Still takes a little effort, but nothing like it did back when I was doing it.
You were working with a lot less back then as far as availability on things you could
Availability
try.
of materials and a lot of materials, inserts and adapters, things like that. I had to have made, custom machine, just because they were not available. Now, extreme FOC, once you've got that structurally intact arrow that flies perfectly, extreme FOC does more than any other feature to increase your arrow's penetration. And the gains we're talking about there range anywhere from 40% to 60% increase in penetration, solely because of FOC. Now, we don't have a lot of data on the ultra extreme, but I can tell you it gives gains greater than 60%.
Is there like before I move on to the next thing, is there like a minimum for like an average arrow build that you would see today? Is there like a minimum you think people should for sure be above?
Well, if they want to gain penetration out of it, they're going to be above 19%.
Have you ever reached a point where too much FOC became a problem?
No. That is a fallacy. Down in New Guinea, I did some work with the natives in New Guinea. They shoot arrows that look like spears. Some of them weighing well over 4,000 grains. And at the highest ones I measured were FOCs that were above 40%. Now, they do not shoot fletched arrows. They shoot unfletched arrows. But all of them are above 30% FOC. And they're using the FOC to control the flight of the arrow. Just sheer having high FOC giving arrow stability in flight. And the very long shafts they shoot, many of them 5 to 6 feet long, also creates a long trailing end, which will increase resistance of the shaft if it tries to deviate off the straight line path. And it's going to try to follow that mass weight up front. It's like throwing a rock on a string. You swing it around your head and throw it, and the string will tail out directly behind the rock.
Yeah, it's kind of something it's kind of hard to achieve. Not that it's hard to achieve, you could do it now, like you said, but if you like increase the FOC a ton on a certain arrow, typically when you add weight to the front, it moves your spine down, and to keep your spine high enough for good arrow flight, you kind of have to keep it in a certain range. Like if you go super, super heavy on the front and increase the FOC to 30% on some arrows, you're under spining it by too much, and then your arrow flight's going to be wonky. So it's like a good balance between the two.
If it comes down to a choice between FOC and perfect arrow flight, you go with perfect arrow flight.
Right. That was just what I was getting at. Yeah.
FOC.
Sure.
In the overall scheme of things. But today it's very easy to achieve both. The components are there. It's no problem at all to do. Now, I do think there's a sweet spot, a place where you see a big jump all of a sudden in penetration. And that's around 25 to 26% FOC. And for whatever reason, right there, the percentage gain you get in penetration makes a big jump. Okay, our fourth factor is the mechanical advantage of the broadhead. Now, mechanical advantage just means you can do more work with the force you have available. That's literally what its definition is. So, if you've got your perfect flying air, structurally intact, perfect flying air, high FOC, or even without high FOC, the next most important thing in increasing your penetration is going to be having high broadhead mechanical advantage. And that's applicable to all eras of all designs. It doesn't matter. That's a law of physics, and so far we can't defy physics.
So, by when you say mechanical advantage, is that that's not the angle of attack of the broadhead?
No, that's the width to length ratio. And you have to consider the number of blades in there too. If you get, take a classic example. We'll make the numbers easy. If you've got a 1 inch wide broadhead that's 3 inches long, that's a 3-to-1 mechanical advantage. Well, when you look at cutting width from the midline of your shaft out to the edge of the broadhead, that is a 1/2 inch. But if you have 3 blades on there, now you don't have that are a 1/2 inch high from the midline of the arrow. You don't have that same 3-to-1 mechanical advantage because you've added that extra blade. Your broadhead width is now not 1 inch, it's 1.5 inches, and your length is 3 inches. So you've got a 2-to-1. You have cut your mechanical advantage by 1/3.
By adding a blade.
By adding 1 blade.
So if you have a 4 blade, you would need to be even longer to achieve that 3-to-1 ideal mechanical advantage.
Yeah, well, take the 3 blade, it would have to be 6 inches long.
And that's essentially best case scenario, or what you want at your minimum as you go down in that.
One is literally as much as you can get. But right now, the highest thing you can get is going to be right at or just slightly above 3-to-1. The original 300 grain tough head, that's a true 3-to-1 broadhead.
Because you don't see many of them mass produced now whatsoever that are at that 3-to-1. A lot of them are short, stubby little things,
Yeah, that's the fashion trend of the day. And when everything goes perfect, anything works. It's building an error that is for the worst case scenario. That's what it's all about. Because that animal does have a vote. If you hunt much, sooner or later, you're going to encounter that worst case scenario.
We've all probably been there for sure. So that's definitely applicable.
Now, the next thing, and this is an easy one today too, is the shaft diameter to ferrule diameter ratio. Your broadhead ferrule should be the widest point of your entire arrow. If you have a shaft that is 5% smaller than the broadhead's ferrule, you'll gain about 10% in penetration, average. But if you make that shaft diameter exceed the broadhead's ferrule, you'll lose 30% of the penetration.
I think I've seen that too. The times that I've shot a very sleek, skinny broadhead that I thought would penetrate well, I've had the biggest arrow shaft I could possibly have too, like a standard diameter. And I've had it to where you do get an entry and an exit, but that arrow still hangs in that animal and maybe just falls out after they run. But there's a lot of drag in that arrow shaft, a lot more than you would think,
Yeah,
as it
and
goes through.
I'm sure you probably discussed it with Troy. The optimum outcome, the outcome you always want, is complete arrow pass through. If that shaft remains in the wound, it's applying pressure on the wound, which impedes hemorrhaging. And what we need is fast hemorrhaging. You don't want that shaft, any part of the arrow remaining in the animal, because that's going to reduce the hemorrhaging that you're going to have. Okay, where are we? Number 6 is arrow mass, and that's strictly arrow weight. You don't have to think of it in terms of mass when you're here on planet Earth hunting. The greater arrow mass increases the efficiency of your bow. The heavier the arrow is, the more of the bow's stored energy it's going to absorb before the arrow leaves the bowstring. That's why your bow shoots quieter. And heavier arrow mass is also going to retain its momentum further down range. So it's going to retain more of its penetration ability the further away you are compared to a lighter projectile.
So when you're talking just strictly the weight of the setup when you're talking mass.
Right. The
Okay.
momentum you get in that arrow is a property of the arrow. It belongs to the arrow. It has nothing to do with the bow or anything else. But once that arrow's out there in flight, how much mass it has determines how much force it is going to be able to retain as it goes down range. And the other thing to remember is in the momentum equation, which is mass times velocity, mass remains constant. Your velocity decreases as you go down range. So the more of that force you can retain in arrow mass, the better it's going to penetrate. Same reason heavy rifle bullets penetrate deeper than lighter rifle bullets.
Yeah, it's something to like we kind of touched on before we started the 12 factors is that everybody thinks, like when you and Troy talk, that they just assume based on the clips they see that mass is like the number one thing, end all be all, because that's what everybody hears is just the total arrow weight and all this stuff. But it's like one, just to understand, to get people to understand, it's just one of the 12 factors.
It's
Like you
just one
said,
of the 12 factors. That's
it,
all
it,
it is.
it adds a percentage to that equation. It's not the end all be all that you have to be at this arrow weight to achieve all these things. Because if you have just the arrow weight and just the mass and none of the other things,
Right. The heavier your area is, the longer it's going to take to stop. Go to whatever points you want to go to. A 500 grain arrow, all other things being equal between two arrows, a 500 grain arrow is going to take longer to stop than a 450 grain arrow. It's just, where are you willing to go to?
yep, understood.
And the other thing that comes into that with the heavier arrows they are flying slower. And resistance increases at an exponential rate. In other words, if you double the velocity of an arrow, the resistance of the air of the tissues, everything increases by a factor of 4. So it's diminishing returns the faster you go.
Got anything on that, Jesse?
I was kind of curious on when you're talking overall arrow weight, are you gaining a lot of that through FOC or are you?
I put as much of the weight at the front of the arrow as I can, and ideally as far forward as I can. I would rather have weight in the broadhead than in the insert.
So I remember,
But there is a limit to it.
I've watched a video. I want to say it was Tom Miranda, where they were in Africa and they would actually fill the shafts of the arrows up with sand or whatever, just to get.
That used to be a common thing. People use sand. Some people put rope in there. Double shafts, and even triple shafts were used in the early days, trying to get mass up. But you don't get high FOC with that.
Mm-hmm.
And, I didn't really get to looking at FOC until in the 1990s, late 1990s. I didn't really think it was that big a factor. Turned out to be extremely important factor. You don't know till you test it.
Yeah, because that example, like you're adding the mass part of it, but you're not necessarily adding anything to the FOC part of it. So you're limited to how much a percentage that's going to help you in the long run because you're not. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, where are we? Number 7 is the edge finish. Now, edge finish is a really important thing that people don't look at. The smoothest, sharpest, thinnest edge you can get is going to produce the best hemorrhaging. Now, that results because of a thing called the clotting cascade. When you cut a blood vessel, the inner lining of that blood vessel releases a enzyme that reacts with the blood that forms pre-thrombin. And that in turn forms thrombin, which is what forms a blood clot. But in order to form a blood clot, it has to attach to tag ends of tissue. A rough surface on the finish of the edge. I'm not talking about how sharp the edge is. I'm talking about how smooth it is. A rough edge along there is like passing a file across that cut tissue. It creates a lot of tag ends of tissue. So when you have that thinnest, which cuts the deepest, it has the highest mechanical advantage. At any given level of tension of the tissue to the edge, the higher the mechanical advantage of the edge bevel, the deeper it's going to cut. So that's where your thin comes in. The smooth comes in because of not creating those tissue tags. And the sharp comes in by reducing the amount of force required to slice.
Sure. That could definitely, I see how a thinner, sharper blade is going to help with the penetration part of it. I feel like and I'm sure you're going to get to it here about the edge retention part of it and or coming into contact with something hard where there might be a little bit of give and take with how thin
Yeah,
tip of the blade is.
You have to have something that will hold up. Now, that's going to vary by the steel, the tempering of the steel. All these little factors come into how thin you can have an edge without the edge either rolling or chipping. Too soft, it's going to roll. Too hard, it's going to chip. So It is a very careful balancing act, and it will vary by every single type of steel.
So in that point, and then in that factor relating to a double bevel broadhead versus a single bevel broadhead, by that factor, and that factor alone, a double bevel most likely, unless it's just a super high angle, either way, is going to penetrate better versus a single bevel? Or is it just based off of the
No,
angle of that blade?
it's in many ways just the opposite. A double bevel is going to be a stronger edge. And if you're shooting an inferior steel, you're going to have a double bevel. A single bevel, in order to perform like it should, is going to have a much higher quality of steel. Now, that higher quality of steel is also going to mean you can get it sharper, and it will retain that edge, that sharpness, better. But it makes the broadhead a lot more expensive. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. I just had a kind of was kind of thinking, there's other little things that depend, like the angle of the blade and the type of steel, like you said. I just was kind of thinking, looking at it like double versus single, and why someone would maybe want one versus the other. But it depends. You can probably get a good quality of either, but you just have to take other certain things into consideration to get the best
Yeah,
performance
but
out of each
but as a
one.
general rule, your double bevel heads are going to be a much softer steel, and are going to be tempered to a lower Rockwell hardness than will a single bevel. Now, single bevel is more like having a high quality knife steel, where cheap knife steels make a pretty good double bevel broadhead.
Would you see any difference if you had a high quality steel in a double bevel?
Do what?
Would you see any difference, I don't know, penetration or cutting wise, if you had a high quality
Well,
steel on a
if
double
you had
bevel?
a high quality steel like that in a double bevel, it would have a stronger edge.
Would there be any benefit in between the two if you had a high quality steel for a double bevel or a single
Not
bevel?
really, because the single bevel offers you some other penetration advantages you do not get with a double bevel. And properly tempered, good quality steel, uh, the single bevels will hold up even going through as much as 5 inches of bone.
Yeah, from what I've heard or seen, the real push for a single bevel is the edge retention and the impact on heavy, hard
Yeah,
bone.
how it performs on bone is its big advantage.
Sure. Yeah, that clarifies a couple of things at least that I had, so that's good.
Okay, shaft profile, uh, tapered shafts do out penetrate parallel shafts. And with compound so forth, you don't have barrel tapered shafts, but traditional shooters still use them some. They're available in wood shafts. But basically, a tapered shaft, if everything else about the arrow, the weight, broadhead, so forth, are all the same, you can get about an 8% penetration gain with a parallel shaft. Now, that was done back before we had some of the shafts we have today, which are substantially smaller in diameter than broadhead ferrules. And today, that's not as big a factor. If you're shooting a compound or even traditional bow, where you've got a large difference between broadhead ferrule size and shaft size, you won't see much difference between a tapered shaft and a parallel shaft. But it's still very applicable to the guys that shoot traditional. You know, ideally they want to shoot a tapered shaft.
Sure. It's a good little note for people that shoot trad.
Okay, our next factor is the broadhead arrow silhouette. Now, we touched on that when I said the ferrule has got to be the biggest, widest diameter portion of your entire arrow. But you also need the surfaces of your broadhead to be as smooth as possible. Any roughness or irregularities along the surface of the arrow, a bump where the blades enter the broadhead's ferrule, which is extremely common on broadheads now. Blades that have welding dimples on them, or that are made where the ferrule is spot welded onto the blade, things like that, all decrease the penetration of your broadhead significantly. Now, additional slickness of your arrow helps, but you've got to be careful how you do that. Some people, I've seen people a lot of times put Vaseline on the edges of their broadhead to keep them from rusting. And Vaseline is a coagulant. The last thing you want to push into a wound that you're trying to make bleed. A lot of spray lubricants are that way. There's one that I did use, a spray lubricant. It's made in Canada. It's called Inox, I-N-O-X. It is an anticoagulant, and it's a very good rust preventative. So if you're hunting with a steel broadhead and need to put some kind of rust corrosion on it, say you're hunting in a tropical climate where they're going to rust every day, if you don't have some kind of rust preventative on them, inox is the way to go of everything I've seen. And I tested that I used to keep paper plates in my workshop, and every time I would cut myself, I'd go over and spray one of these paper plates or smear whatever kind of lubricant on there and put drops of blood on there and see how long it took them to coagulate. So I used myself as a guinea pig to find out what worked.
Yeah, probably not. Probably don't want to be cutting yourself on all the time, but definitely
Yeah,
works.
well, I only did it when it was an accident, but I had enough accidents that I was able to test them all.
Yeah, shooting that many animals and being around broadheads that much, I'm sure you got caught a fair
Oh,
share.
yeah.
Now, do you see any difference in like a one piece design broadhead versus some have like vented blades where there's cutouts in them? Does that correlate with that?
Vented blades weaken your broadhead and they cause increased drag. And I have seen shooting through those buffalo ribs where there's bone. I've seen the fragments of the bone, little splinters of bone get caught in those blades and stop the arrow dead cold.
I never thought about that. If you have that gap, I mean, granted, it's probably not a common occurrence, but if you're going through something with a lot of that's very volume heavy or hard parts like that, and you like a broken rib, like you're saying, get in that gap on a solid blade, it's just going to rub against the side. Yeah, it might put friction on it and slow it down a little bit, but it's not getting in there and completely, having to drag that along with it. I guess I never really even considered that as a possibility, but that's a good point there too.
Yeah, and it's pretty common to see vented blades break on heavy bone. You've taken a lot of the support out of that blade, and it gets a hard blow on it. It very well may fracture on you.
Yeah. Yeah. If you take that much out of the steel, there's only so much places that reaction can go to. You got half your blade cut out. That energy's got to go somewhere, and you took out the vast majority of the blade.
Yeah, that goes back to structural integrity. Way back to factor one. That's a failure of structural integrity.
Yeah. So yeah, you could kind of go through the whole system, and at step 9, you run into an issue. You could even go all the way back and reference your first two points and see where you failed.
Now, where are we?
Number 10, I think we're at.
10. Type of edge bevel. If you take broadheads that are absolutely identical in all aspects and test them side by side on the same animal, on arrows that have the same shaft, same length, same weight, everything the same. One is a single bevel, one is a double bevel. The single bevel versions, when bone is hit, demonstrate a penetration increase in 100% of the cases in our test data. There is no question that a single bevel gives you a huge advantage when bone is hit. Light bone, heavy bone, any bone. Now, the gains in penetration varies by profile, design of the broadhead, shape of the broadhead. And it ranged everywhere from a low of 14% to a high of 58%. So it's a highly critical factor when you hit a bone. Now, it did show even in all soft tissue hits, they show a slight gain in penetration. And even though they're going in a spiral path, which means they're cutting a longer wound channel through the tissues, I can only speculate that gain is because it has a thinner, smoother, sharper cutting edge that cuts with less resistance, conserving a little bit of the arrow's force. That's the only thing I can come up with why it would make such a difference in soft tissues. They're not nearly as high as the percentage differences in a bone hit, but they do outpenetrate in soft tissues too. So it's a win-win. There's no downside to shooting a single bevel, yet there are a number of upsides to shooting a single bevel.
And that just shows you that's kind of what I was getting at or wanting to touch on earlier when I brought that up, the differences between them. But it just shows that your 12 factors kind of do cover almost everything, like I was trying to think of something that you might not cover and you ended up covering it right there. Kind of what I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into, and you just answered it. If you have everything the same, just the one versus the other, that there are more advantages to a single bevel. Or if everything is the same between the two and the only difference is that blade, the double versus single. So
And that rotating twisting effect in bone can be devastating. When we look at the entire study, there is not a single large bone split with a double bevel broadhead. But yet we have had numerous cases where shoulder blades were split end to end by a single bevel, and long splits on heavy long bones like the humerus bone. where the split would be several inches long. And you just don't get that with a double bevel head. When you go through a scapula, particularly through the flat of the scapula, with a double bevel broadhead, you get a cut that's the profile of the broadhead. That's all you get. You don't get the bone split. But you put that single bevel through there, you will get splits out the edges of where the broadhead went through.
Sure. Yeah. I've heard that. That makes sense.
Okay, our 11th factor is the tip design. Now, tip design is really important when you look at resistance to bends, structural integrity again, and in the tendency to skip or skid off of bones when the impact between broadhead and bone is not at a 90-degree angle. And overall, hands down, the Tanto tip is the best performer in both categories. So that Tanto tip design is amazing. I took the same broadhead and put 7 different tip designs on it and looked at the bone penetration. The outcome penetration with the Tanto tip was 110% better than the worst performing of the tips and 27.5% better than the second best performer, which was a rounded tip. Bone breaker, trocar points, things like that have very poor skip angles. And when you think about a lot of guys tree stand hunt out of tree stands, most do in the States. Think about what you're doing. If the deer is close, you're shooting down at a deer at his back. Well, you've got ribs coming off extremely curved. And if you're shooting straight down at him or at an angle down at him, you're going to be hitting the bone at something other than a 90-degree angle. And the chances of having that broadhead skip or skid, either sliding off and not even penetrating into the thorax, or redirecting, which is going to suck up a lot of your arrow force, reduce your arrow penetration. So you want something that tends to bite into the bone and not skip or skid. Now, it's interesting that we do get an increase in its functionality when we couple the Tanto tip with a single bevel. The Tanto tip on a single bevel tends to rotate as it hits, and it bites into the bone better and tends to not skip or skid off. It has the best skip angle of any edge bevel broad tip design combination.
And for people that don't know what a Tanto tip is, it's almost like the last little bit of the tip. It's not a very peaked point. It's almost like it's at an angle a little bit. It
Well,
versus
most people nowadays are familiar with a knife with a Tanto tip because they've become so common.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of taking 2 of those and putting them back to back, that's where I came up with the name. That's what it reminded me of, was taking 2 of those knives and putting them back to back.
And is there a reason, we don't have to touch on it too much more before we go into the 12th factor, but you kind of explained that it bites into bone better and it's better on harsh angles. Is there a reason that angle of that tip?
A lot of it is the strength and the angle of the tip. Now, Tanto tips, I have always sharpened like a single bevel. Although the double bevel does pretty well. But like I said, if you couple the two together, a single bevel broadhead with that 10-toe tip, you got that broadhead rotating and biting into the bone. But I sharpen the 10-toe tip itself with a single bevel because I like to think of it much like a drill. So that is going in and cutting it, biting in at an angle.
Makes sense.
Okay, our 12th factor, we touched on it before, is the heavy bone threshold. Having an error mass or weight above the heavy bone threshold. And I did several thousand. This is a focal study. They're not part of the regular database. I've got several databases that are where I was looking at one thing. And it doesn't matter what broadhead you use. Every broadhead we tested showed an abrupt increase in the frequency of penetrating a bone when the error mass was 650 grains and above. That 650 grain threshold held for all of them. Now, if you take a broadhead that's a real poor performer on bone, below 650, it might penetrate 8% of the time. And above 650, it went to 11% of the time. But it showed this abrupt increase. Now, when you get into the really good performing broadheads, you take a single bevel that's 3-to-1 mechanical advantage, sleek profile, got everything going for it, and it's below 650. It's going to penetrate heavy bone better than 50% of the time. But when you get above 650, that jumps to 100% in our testing. That threshold is just held in hell. And Rob has retested that using compounds, because I was doing it with traditional bows, but he was using an 82-pound compound, and it still holds.
Sure. And I think that, like you said, it's one of the 12 factors. It's the last factor.
It's only important when you hit a heavy bone.
Right. It's dependent. And there's a lot of people that get that 650 number in their head, and they feel like it's not attainable or it's not achievable.
That's just one more of those factors in the tool chest. Add it if you want to. If you want to get the most out of your error, you're going to be adding it. If you're satisfied without it, can live without it, don't put it in there.
Mm-hmm. Sure. But you're just saying there was a significant, and for people that have read your studies, at that 650, there was a significant increase, even when it was unideal in other areas. That 650 is a number where it drastically increases it.
If you hit a heavy bone, it will drastically, using any broadhead, it will improve your chances of getting through that heavy bone.
And is that at any distance, or was that just in the testing distance of that shorter range?
That was tested just like the others at 20 yards.
Okay. Sure. So it's inconclusive at distance whether that holds true. Like a longer distance. If you had a
longer distance, it would be hard to tell. But regardless, again, going back to momentum, you've got a lot of the force of that error invested in the error mass, the weight of the error. So it's going to have more force than a lighter error at any given distance.
Makes sense. Well,
I got kind of a question on like broadhead's design.
Sure.
Is there a reason, and maybe it's the reason I ask is because I kind of like overanalyze a lot of things. Is there a reason the majority of single bevels are all a right bevel. And the only reason,
Because most people use right fletching.
yeah,
'Cause
and the
that's
only
what I
reason
kind of
I ask is,
And that's the only reason. It doesn't matter as long as they match.
yeah, and the only reason I ask is the majority of your bows nowadays, compounds, naturally when you shoot a bear shaft, it wants to rotate to the left. So I usually fletch all my arrows with a left helical to try to aid an arrow flight, or it just keep everything as natural as what the arrow wants to do. And wanting to go to a single bevel broadhead, now I'm going to be fighting just the natural twist of the arrow.
Yeah, you do not want to mix them. You actually lose penetration
Yep.
if you mix them.
And I just didn't know, because I know a lot of guys will just shoot a right bevel with right helical, and me trying to find a left turn single bevel.
Left single
hard.
bevel. There are some companies that make them for that very reason.
where that's a scenario where if you were, if you didn't want to toy with your arrows and fletching them right instead, like, see, even though your bow wants to turn them left to match if you're going based on the head, you'd want to, even though your bow wants to turn it left, your arrow would correct and you'd have to probably fletch them right and go make sure your fletchings and your bevel were both right.
Yeah, clocking of the arrow is a very slow rotation. So it wouldn't take much fletching to reverse that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know what it would be, 0.5% that it might reduce the effectiveness of your arrow. If it clocks to the left and you want to stay with left, stay with left.
And that may be a scenario where it's a give and take and you just shoot a double bevel and it doesn't matter instead of a single, whereas,
Yeah, these are all compromises you make.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One other follow up here. I want to wrap it up here soon just because I know Jesse's got some stuff to do and I don't want to keep you for too long, but there was a lot of information in that 12 steps, and I know I'm going to rewatch this a bunch of times and write stuff down because it was very valuable. But
Well, you got more questions, come back. I'm
Yep.
always willing to get on with you.
Absolutely, and it's definitely going to happen. I want to do that again. If Jesse doesn't have any other questions, I had one thing to discuss, or one thing that came up for me, I guess we could talk about, or get your thoughts on it at least, that I've heard from people that had that question, and I think you'd be a good person to hear your thoughts on it. Is you hear people say that listen to your stuff and Troy's stuff say wasted energy, or have this theory about wasted energy, right? Like, you build this arrow that penetrates so well that with a small cutting diameter, let's say you have a 1-inch cut single bevel, very small, penetrates very well through bone, that it's, going through every single thing they shoot in their scenario, and they call it wasted energy because they start to increase their cutting diameter to get to a point where they're penetrating everything they want to, but also maximizing the cut size. But they don't want to, they call it wasted energy when you go through something with a small cut, because they could essentially get a wider cut and still pass through. What are your thoughts on that wasted energy concept?
Well, penetration is paramount. Well, hang on a second. Where have I got that? Now, this doesn't deal with arrows. It deals with firearms. But where is that? Okay, this is from an FBI white paper from September 26, 2014. The single most important factor in effectively wounding a human target is to have penetration. So that just pretty well boils it down. It goes on to say the critical element is penetration. The bullet must pass through large blood-bearing organs. Too little penetration will get you killed. Now, if they're shooting something they can guarantee is going every time, that's pretty hard to do. I haven't seen many large cut broadheads that go through bone well. As a matter of fact, it would be zero.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's like one of those things where how I think it's just a question people have, that shoot something small and are not getting good blood trails, but they're passing through like a shoulder blade every time or one
Mhm.
shoulder. They're like seeing what they can get away with in a sense, like I'm getting through with this small thing all the time when there's no blood. If I increase the cut size, you know, am I going to still be able to pass through, you know, and still get a little bit bigger cut, a little bit more blood? But in that sense, I feel like in my mind, I don't know how much if I'm getting a pass every time and hitting hard things and still going through, I don't know how much I'm going to toy with that, because if you're going through hard things and passing through and getting two holes, I mean, I would assume that you're getting a vital quick kill every
Yeah.
time.
So the thing to do, and people don't do near enough of it, is push their setup to the limit. You know, shooting an animal with an arrow doesn't destroy much meat. You've got an animal down, freshly down, because you don't want rigor mortis influencing your results. Set him up, take some shots into heavy bone. Shoot through the hips, through the pelvic girdle. That's a heavy bone. Can you still pass through it? You know,
Yeah,
shoot
just
through both shoulders. Try
Yeah.
to take the ball joint out. Successfully go through it and get a pass through. If you can do that for the size animal you test on, then you've got a good setup. Find out for yourself. That's what testing's all about.
it's a good point. I might have to try that this year,
Well,
getting a deer
people
down
take
or
me doing
something.
that.
And
That's how you learn is find the limits of what your setup is capable of doing. And once you know those limits, you know how to hunt with it.
yeah, it's hard for, like you said, it's hard for people that, in the Midwest, sometimes people only get one or two tags a year or get one or two opportunities. It's hard for people to do that amount of testing like Troy can do with all the pigs and stuff,
Mhm.
you know, shooting 10, 20 test subjects a year
Yeah, but
to do
even
that
limited
testing.
testing like that will tell you something, to find out, is the arrow I'm hunting with, is it capable of going through the pelvic girdle? Animals turn. I've hit animals in the pelvic girdle before when I was trying to shoot them in the shoulder. It does happen. The longest shot I ever made on an animal was 42 yards. It was, as far as I know, the first southern bushbuck ever taken with a bow by anybody. Um, it was across a water hole, and I couldn't cut the distance any further. Now I practiced out at long range. I I think long range practice helps your close range shooting. Um, and it was kind of quartering towards me, but when I shot, it wheeled and I hit it right square through the pelvic girdle. Well, the arrow passed completely through, cut the femoral artery. He died. He went 10 yards and died. So
Much
those
more
kind of
so.
hits do occur.
Yeah. I'll take the I'll take the watching them die in sight and going through something hard.
Well, that's always people talk about blood trails. Narrow broadheads don't leave but big blood trails. When I see him fall, I don't need a blood trail to recover.
Yeah. It's not very arguable. Yeah, I will like you said,
And you have
I'll
the other
agree with you.
advantage, that there's no such thing as overkill with an
That
arrow.
that's kind of what I was getting at. That's the same premise is the wasted energy is overkill. It's kind of the same type of thing that people are starting to bring up when they look at like a small cut on contact head that doesn't leave good blood trails. That's the people that are bringing that up are the people that are shooting animals really far back in the guts with those, and where you're not going to have a quick recovery regardless, and then that is not really what that head's designed for essentially.
At any given point in time, I hunted everything from rabbits up with the arrow that I used to buffalo hunt with. It was the best setup I knew how to build at the time I was building it. And on smaller animals, and I'm talking deer size, even slightly larger than deer size, on up pushing to elk size. Now, I've taken a lot of flack for saying this. I shot to break them down. I shot to take the shoulders out because I had an arrow setup I knew could do it. You can't do that with an arrow setup that is less effective. That's not wasted energy. That's killing the animal as effectively as you can kill him. You break his shoulders out, he doesn't go very far. He might push himself along for a few yards, but that's about it.
Yep. That just comes back to that plan B. You're building something that you know is going to handle that, and maybe a lot of time it seems like it's wasted energy. 90% of the time you don't have that plan B shot, but you never know. Like you said, on a live animal, you have no idea what's going to happen.
Well, I told you earlier, I was a stalking hunter. Often I couldn't wait around for a perfect shot. I took a lot of shots that your typical bow hunter is going to pass up because his arrow won't do it.
Yeah. Why limit yourself?
Yeah. When I talked about Jeremy Johnson being the best elk hunter I know, probably the best elk hunter in North America because of his stalking ability, he has shot several of these, and I'm talking monstrous elk, end to end with complete arrow pass through. He didn't wait around. He's a stalker like me. He couldn't wait around for that perfect shot. If you're calling elk in, you're commonly looking at a frontal shot. Well, that takes a good bit of penetration. And, well, the light bow shooters have gained a lot of advantage by incorporating these 12 factors. Emily Thompson shot an eland, which is moose size, in Africa, on an extreme quartering away. She took it in the left hip and had 5.5 feet of arrow penetration. She got a 25-inch draw. Shooting a light poundage bow. Having the right arrow set up that allows you to take how many of these people that are hunting out of tree stands, if they saw the buck of a lifetime and it wasn't a perfect broadside shot, are going to pass the shot up?
Very many, and then it ends poorly.
It ends poorly.
That's an issue that's not talked about enough. But if you don't have a as solid of an arrow setup, it's just a limitation. You're going to have to limit your shots and your angles and stuff if you have that lesser arrow. But the last thing I want to talk about before we end it and leave you with is it's just is another argument that people, not an argument, a point that people that argue for, like an expandable broadhead or a light setup are liking to say now is that a lot of your studies and a lot of the stuff you guys do is short range, and a lot of your studies were done with a traditional bow, right?
Well,
They're
mine
saying,
were, but all of the studies since 2001 have been done with heavy compounds.
right. That was going to be my question is there anything that says that doesn't translate to people
So
say
far,
that
every test that Rob has repeated came up with the same results I found.
Sure. Because people say, yeah, today's bows are more efficient. You can't take data that was done with a traditional bow and say that's going to work with a compound. So I was just curious if that's translated over.
Well, so far, everything has been translated over. Mechanical advantage, he's tested that thoroughly. Same results. He took the same arrow, same weight broadhead, different profile. With the high mechanical advantage, he had complete pass-throughs, every shot with a lower mechanical advantage, stopped against the offside ribs.
Yeah,
Sounds pretty convincing to me.
I think with people today, that argument is we got such higher efficiency bows than a traditional bow that they're wanting to get away with less. Shooting faster bows, shooting lighter arrows. They don't think they need that heavy FOC or heavy arrows just because that bow is that much quicker than a traditional bow.
Yep, but you got to remember, speed, resistance goes up by a factor of 4. You double your speed, which most compounds are easily double my longbows that I hunted with, but their resistance to penetration is much higher. Their resistance flying through the air is much higher.
See, I think that's a key point that a lot of people don't realize or even knew about. I honestly didn't know that before this.
Yeah. I think, I don't know. I don't know if it'll ever swing back the other way. I feel like
It probably won't, because the industry makes money.
Yeah.
Speed sells.
Yep. That's all you hear now is large cut diameter and low trajectory. Fast arrows at distance will cut down on the animal's reaction time. But you said right away at the beginning of this podcast, you're not beating a reaction. And when you're close, it's almost worse because I don't care how fast it is, it's still going to make the same amount of noise or more noise close up, which is going to get a larger reaction yet. It's a lot of stuff that it's hard to. The guys just got to kind of block out the noise and get a system that works for them. That's going to work, as much as possible for them, and never be satisfied. Keep tinkering.
And that's why I try to encourage people to test as much as they can. If it's only 1 or 2 shots, you at least have a chance to test the effectiveness of the setup you're hunting with on adverse hits. It's a golden opportunity that most people don't take.
I'm going to do that this year if I get a deer or a doe or something, set it up and maybe try some different angles or different areas of the body and just see how well, that current setup works.
Your arrow holds up, what it will penetrate, what it will do.
Well, up here, geez, you can go half a mile each direction of my house and find a deer laying dead on the side of the road too. So you could even
that would work good.
Well, Ed, I don't want to keep any longer. I can't really express how much it means to sit down and talk with you. I know there's a lot of people in the industry that, don't take your words lightly and really respect what you do. And you can't help but knowing the amount of testing and time and effort and money you put into, trying to figure this stuff out.
On my dime.
Yep. So, like I said, I think we both can speak for each other when we appreciate your time. I know a lot of people. Hopefully, we can get this out to as many people as possible, and I think it's worth a listen. I think this is one of the better episodes we've done thus far as like information goes. And I think I could rewatch this, multiple times and take something away each time from it. So, I appreciate your time. Before we let you go, maybe hit on your foundation and where people can kind of find your information and kind of read it verbatim.
The website is Ashby Bowhunting, all one word, .org, E-O-R-G.
Okay. So we'll link that. We'll link the website down in the description of the podcast when we put the episode out. I'm sure we'll post some clips of some stuff too here. Rough plan is probably drop it this Friday. So it'll be about 5 or so days.
Let me know when it drops. Yeah, I'll forward it on. I got a number of people that follow everything I'm on down in Australia, so I'll forward it on down to them.
Sounds good. I will. Well, we appreciate you hopping on and talking with us. We'll let you enjoy the rest of your stogie there and have a good rest of your night.
I will. Y'all have a fantastic day.
Thanks.
Thank you.